welcome. It's great to see you. And I want to thank you for this private briefing with a diverse group from both sides of the pond. And I do want to welcome two of our advisors that are based in China. So one is Ann Bark, who I believe now is in her home state, or her home country, I guess I should say, of the Netherlands, and who's based in Shanghai and who helped us tremendously throughout the years. And Michelle Gahn, who was our inaugural sponsor in Beijing and has supported our programs both in Beijing and Shanghai. So, and also is a sponsor of our Mass for Humanities program. So I want to welcome them as well. And so we're all excited for your presentation. And now that the presidential election is over and Biden has won, although I absolutely believe we will need a crowbar and the Navy SEALs to extract the current president out of office, we are excited to move forward on a new page of rebuilding relationships with our allies, particularly, which has been absolutely damaged under this administration, and to re-engage in multilateral organizations. So the Paris Climate Accords, the World Health Organization, we're looking forward to engaging. And Biden will have many challenges. And I think now with the nuclear scientists assassinated, the Israeli and Iranian relationship is now deepened, and your country still can't figure out Brexit. So this week is challenging for you all. So hopefully that will exit finally. And then, as you know, Martin, I'm a Sinophile, so I'm all things China. China's prolific investment in Africa via their Belt and Road Initiative, China's engagement with the US and our trade wars, and China's relationship with Europe. So I'm interested with all of this in the overlay of COVID, right? So we have, which I call the biggest elephant in the room. Vaccination started in Russia with their Sputnik 5, and your country has started via the NHS and Pfizer, deploying vaccinations throughout the country. And hopefully with the FDA's visitation on meeting on Thursday, that we will be able to, in short order, start, although I'm not confident that the distribution will be as effective. So there's much to discuss. And so as a chief commentator, economics commentator for the Financial Times, we're looking to you to talk about sort of what is the global state of play outside of all of this. And I'm hoping on the back end that the questions will round out your discussion.
So it's a great pleasure to be with you. I enjoyed very much our London discussion some years ago, which was Brexit, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
So this is going to be broader, as you've asked. I'm going to try and keep it to 25 minutes because I always enjoy the Q&A most. But it's difficult because so much has been going on. What I want to do is divide my discussion, my talk, into 4 parts, which I hope will have a certain logic to them. And I'll try to explain where I am so people don't get lost. I know this is always a problem. I'm going to start by talking about the world as it was before COVID-19. And then I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID-19, namely 2020, which was obviously a year of enormous turmoil, economically, socially, and of course, because of this health crisis. Then I'm going to talk about what lies ahead. And there's so much to say on this, but I will hit some of the big things. And if I have time, I will talk, I think, about one issue specifically, which is risks. And I want to emphasize what I think is the biggest lesson we've learned from the last 15 years of successive crises, which is systemic vulnerability or fragility. So that's basically what I want to cover. And of course, by the way, that last bit will very much link to climate issues, which you've already mentioned. So first of all, the world before COVID-19. I can't go back, because I don't have the time, to the last several centuries or even the last half century. I just want to start off with the very obvious fact, which is a rare event, that COVID-19, which is the biggest economic crisis since the Second World War, followed a very big economic crisis only 15 years ago with the global financial crisis, or more precisely, the transatlantic financial crisis. Have two such big economic crises in a period of essentially 12 years is quite extraordinary. I mean, the only comparable experience really is the period from 1929 to the Second World War, which is obviously catastrophically worse. But we've had two huge crises in succession. And the financial crisis has had many legacies, of which I think the most important from an economic point of view was that in the Western world, we never fully recovered. And in particular, we never fully recovered our economic dynamism as measured by productivity growth. And it bequeathed a very large overhang of debt in both the private and even more the public sectors. So that was there as a result of this crisis. It also bequeathed or helped to bequeath a significant political crisis. It reinforced the view in many parts of the West that our elites, both business and governmental, so both politicians and bureaucracies, were not effective, that they didn't know what they were doing. And not only were they didn't know what they were doing, but they were in significant measures corrupt. And that reinforced the already well-established sense in large parts of our populations that the economy was not working for them. And so this created political fragility. And I define political fragility, so this is the second pre-COVID-19 situation, as a situation in which sort of, one way of putting it is that anything can happen. That doesn't mean anything will happen, but things like the election of Donald Trump or Brexit, which would have been clearly unthinkable in 2004, became thinkable after the financial crisis. The third big thing that was happening before COVID-19, perhaps arguably the biggest of all, is the profound shift in global economic power, which you've already mentioned, and above all, the rise of China as a great power, as a superpower, which began really in the 1980s and accelerated through the early years of this century, and remarkably continued almost unabated through the global financial crisis. The growth in China slowed after 2012, but even so remained at a very high level, much higher than anywhere else. The fourth thing that happened, was happening before COVID-19, was a very clear cessation of the dynamic of globalization. It would be wrong to say that the world was radically deglobalizing, even under Donald Trump, but it is very clear that the long period prior to 2008, at least 30, even 40 years, in which trade, capital flows, particularly foreign direct investment, movement of people as well, were growing rapidly relative to the economy, relative to the population of the world, this stopped. So this is a complicated story, but the unbundling of supply chains we saw as the characteristic of globalization stopped to a modest degree, reversed. And of course, this culminated in the trade wars begun by Donald Trump, notably with China, though not, of course, exclusively with China. And the very last pre-COVID reality is that despite a great deal of talk about it, nothing effective was done to manage the climate crisis. There was an immense amount of conversation. The Paris Accord was a not insignificant but very small step. And then, of course, notoriously, the United States pulled out of it, the process. And that was part of a wider breakdown before COVID-19 in multilateral cooperation, and which again was crystallized in at least two very important events, one of which I mentioned, Donald Trump's trade wars, another, the failure to proceed really in any effective way with the Paris Accords, and then, of course, deglobalization. So that's where we were before COVID-19, really quite difficult situation globally in terms of the big economic powers, particularly for the West. Then let's return to my second major section, which is on the impact of COVID-19. I think it's pretty clear that the recession this year will turn out to globally to be the deepest since the 1930s. It is going to be more widely shared, probably than any recession ever. I think the only significant economy that will grow this year will be China, and it's expected to grow by about 2%, despite the impact in the first half of the year. There was a very strong recovery in many economies, not all, in the third quarter. And the general expectation is that the economic recessions in most Western countries will be somewhat smaller than was feared 6 months ago. But the second, or in the case of the US, essentially third wave of the pandemic has hit the West hard. It's hit India very hard. And the fourth quarter looks pretty bad. So this is a terrific, colossal recession with immense consequences, some of which I'll come to in a moment. The second important feature of the COVID-19 year, and it is worth stressing because most people, I think, have been surprised by this, is just how big what is conceptually actually quite a modest pandemic, how big its impact has been. And I think that's linked to something I'm going to talk about at the end, which is what it's made clear is how fantastically vulnerable we are to systemic events of this kind. I mean, many people were aware that a pandemic would be a really big problem for us. But I think what is extraordinary is how big a problem it's turned out to be for us, how difficult it is for us to manage this in terms of the health effects and in terms of the economic effects. So that's the second big lesson. The third big lesson is that, as a general proposition, the East Asians, which includes, interestingly, the Australasians, have done far, far better in managing the pandemic than the West. And also, I should have mentioned South America. Africa has actually done rather well. A lot of that is to do, in fact, with quite sensible policy. And a lot of it is simply to do with the fact that Africa is very, very young. And the young are relatively invulnerable to this disease. It's a disease of old people. South America, Europe and America, North America, being very, very badly hit. And this is sort of bears on the effectiveness of their politics, the effectiveness of their bureaucracies, and the discipline of their populations. And I think in retrospect, this will probably be seen as a year in which the prestige of the East Asians, both the communist East Asians, Vietnam and China, and the non-communist East Asians, South Korea and Japan, for example, Taiwan, at least at the moment, it's politically independent, whatever it might be juridically. These have all done incredibly well. So that's the third big lesson. The fourth point is can we expect a reasonable recovery next year? And that, of course, will be reinforced if the vaccines indeed turn out to work. But it's going to be very spotty. The vaccines will not be rolled out globally. Trade movement of people will therefore not be fully restored. And it is nearly certain that the world economy in most countries affected by the crisis will not be back where they were in 2019 next year. And with luck, they might get back to 2019 in 2022 in terms of GDP levels and GDP per head, but the lost output is likely to be permanent. So to take one salient example, the US, a recent analysis by the Congressional Budget Office, which will be very similar for Europe, assumes that the losses of this pandemic in terms of economic losses of income will not be fully regained. We will not be back, the US will not be back to where it would have been if previous trends had continued until the end of the 2020s. So it could be 10 years. In our case, most European countries, the hope is that it will be 5 to 10 years. This would make the cumulative economic losses as a result of COVID-19, if this is true, incomparably the biggest losses of any economic event since the war. And one friend of mine has co-authored a paper, Larry Summers and David Cutler co-authored a paper which look at the economic losses and also the losses through a sort of standard methodology, which we can debate in terms of illness and death. And they compute that this is going to amount to 90% of 1 year's GDP in the US. So these are absolutely colossal losses, the scars of which will remain for a very, very long time. These losses are, of course, socially uneven. The illness is mainly a burden on the old. We know that. Mostly it's the old who die. But the economic losses and the secondary consequences of those economic losses have been, in this case, somewhat different from the financial crisis, actually being felt mostly by women, ethnic minorities, and the young. And of course, people who do jobs which require face-to-face contact, which on the whole have tended to be people who don't have university degrees. So it's highly unequal socially, and that's quite generally true. And that will have, I think, very long-term consequences. The final legacy of COVID-19 is, of course, fiscal. All governments that have the capacity to do so have spent colossally. Fiscal deficits have been enormous, varying between 10 and 20% of GDP in the developed world. Debt is exceptionally cheap because of monetary policy responses. That has allowed them to do this fairly easily. At the moment, it looks affordable, and I believe it's completely sensible. But there's no doubt the debt level left will be extraordinary. So if we looked at the developed countries as a whole, so it's mainly Western Europe and the United States, but also Japan and South Korea, the aggregate ratio of public debt to GDP at the end of this crisis is forecast by the IMF to be roughly where it was at the end of the Second World War. And so that's a colossal debt overhang, exceptionally cheap debt. And in addition, which was not true at the end of the Second World War, the private sector will also emerge with exceptionally high levels of debt. So we will end up very debt encumbered, and that's one of the reasons why the expectation is that the scars of this crisis will last, but it's not the only one. The labor market effects I've discussed are also important reasons why the scars will last. And of course, during the crisis, there's been essentially no investment by firms. They've all been sitting on their hands for very understandable reasons. And that is a very significant burden. I should add perhaps one final thing which I hadn't been thinking about, which occurred through the crisis, is of course a massive acceleration in the adoption of new technologies like the one we are using today, which has made possible for a vast number of people to work from home. It's accelerated working at a distance. And that, I think, will have very significant consequences for the future pattern of work, and possibly for a different aspect of globalization, which I call virtual globalization, which is, I think, likely to be accelerated. So that's the impact of COVID-19. Now let me talk a bit more about what lies ahead. I've talked about some of it, but I just want to focus on some of the challenges we confront in the next few minutes. There's been a lot of discussion, and this is obviously related to the election of President Biden, or future President-elect Biden, you would say. There's been a lot of discussion about building back better. I think that's been true in the US, and it's certainly been true in Europe. And there's a lot of discussion of this. My guess is that this is going to be very, very difficult. And it's going to be very difficult for two reasons. First, most governments are not very strong domestically. Mr. Biden is, of course, clearly going to have to cooperate with the Republicans to some degree. That's going to be, I would guess, nightmarish. It depends clearly in part what happens in Georgia. So I'm not going to commit any prediction on that. But Europe too, there are profound differences among the European countries about how radical they want to be. There are profound questions about how funding will work after the crisis is over. Obviously, the ECB has played a big role in managing the crisis. Will it continue to do so? I think there's going to be, in the end, quite a lot of emphasis on trying to restore what was rather than transformative policy making. But that's going to be a big question. How different will policy really be? How different will the aim be? Will they be trying really to transform economies and societies in the way they did during the 30s and after the Second World War in particular? Or is it really going to be an attempt to restore what was? And that, of course, is going to be related to what people think their long-run fiscal positions are going to be. And my guess is that in many countries, there'll be a lot of pressure to bring deficits back under control. I think that will be a mistake, but I think that's what's going to happen. And a lot of that is bound to occur on the spending side. And that's going to make it very, very difficult for governments to do much in the way of building back better. The second big issue, which is closely related to that, is how radical people are going to be on climate. There's a lot of discussion, of course, on the need, particularly in the Western world, to halve emissions by 2030. That can only happen with the most colossally radical investment programs, transformations of energy systems across the Western world. The EU is talking about this, and the British government is talking about this. I hope they'll do it, but I must say my own guess is it won't happen, that we're going to find that this is just beyond them. But that's clearly a very, very big challenge. And in America, given the political situation, I think it's going to be even more difficult. But that's a very big question. How far will building back better take the form of a massive energy transformation, the Western world, particularly over the next 10 years, because they're sort of expected to show the way. The third issue about what lies ahead, Deirdre has already mentioned, is the new configuration of the US in the world and its alliances and its stance vis-a-vis China. My own expectation is that under Mr. Biden, the US and the EU will find themselves aligned on many issues. Climate is one, at least at the rhetorical level, and relations with China are clearly another. But I think that alignment is probably going to coincide with a much more strategically worked out, but nonetheless equally demanding relationship with China. The EU and the US have very similar complaints about Chinese policies in a lot of areas, particularly trade policy and investment policy and technology policy. They have similar concerns about security, their own security vis-a-vis China. And I believe that what we are likely to see is not a restoration of genuine multilateralism, but a greater reliance of the US on its relationships with its traditional allies in confronting China. So that will make life more difficult, not easier. And that's at least my guess. I think it's the fourth big thing I see for the future is I don't believe that the populism that brought us Trump and Brexit is over. And it is even possible that COVID-19 will worsen it because it has created new classes of losers, very significant classes of losers. And I don't think the governments in power will be able to satisfy those losers, to make them feel that they are going to be well treated. And that, I think, will mean that though I think the leaders we will have in power will do their best, I think this bubbling away of anger and anxiety, the mixture of anger and anxiety that has fueled populism, both of the left and the right, will continue. It will be a semi-permanent future of Western politics, both in the US and both in North America and in Europe. And this then links with my fifth area, which is the future of globalization. It follows obviously from both what I said about the US and the West vis-a-vis China and populism and populist pressures, that I think the anti-globalization forces will continue to be very powerful. We're not going to go back to the pre-financial crisis world. There is a real risk, my next point, that the world economy, particularly the regulatory structure of the world economy in areas like tech, competition policy, technology upon autonomy and security, that the world will disintegrate more profoundly between a Chinese sphere and a Western sphere. I think it'll be a bit more now a Western sphere than an American versus a European sphere, though that could also happen. But these will not be clean breaks. They will be messy breaks, because there are lots and lots of countries in the world which will want to preserve good relationships with both sides. And how that will work out, we don't really know. So that's what I think. There's a sort of main issues. I could talk about the future of the UK and the EU, but I'm going to leave that to question. Because we don't really know, because it's going to be decided in part today, which makes it sort of impossible. Why is Boris Johnson going to meet Mrs. van der Leyen? And since that's so, I think comment on that would be foolish. So let me just say, make my very last comment. What I think I've discussed what lies ahead, or some of the issues about what lies ahead and the questions. I think one of the things we have learned very, very profoundly with the financial crisis followed by the COVID-19 crisis, so a financial breakdown and then a global health crisis, is something which sort of was intellectually clear, but has become much clearer as a result of experience. What one experiences is always different from what one imagines an experience will be. It's true in life and it's true for peoples. And the actual experience has taught us that we have created, and it's not very surprising, a global system. We have a global economic system, profoundly interlocking. When it's under pressure, we go national. The natural response is at the national level. And this was more true in the pandemic than it was in the financial crisis, because global cooperation has broken down more profoundly since then. So the G20 was far more effective in the financial crisis than it's been this time. And it's not at all clear that that will change. And we have learnt that our systems are fragile and they're highly interdependent, that our economic, financial, political, and health systems are highly interdependent. And that creates obviously a tremendous challenge if, when the crises hit, we all go national, or tend to demand that we go national, close borders, demand our national politicians protect us. This becomes very difficult to handle. And one symptom of that, and this is my very last remark, is that it's pretty obvious that the world is going to find it very, very hard to roll out, to just take one aspect of this, the vaccines that will be needed across the world. It looks very much as though the rich countries will take all the vaccines first, and they will be rolled out over the developing countries to the extent that they are, very, very slowly in the subsequent years, 2022, 2023, or later. And so we have, in some sense, one world, but it's very fragmented, and crises make this worse. And that concludes what I have to say about where we are.
Wonderful. Martin, thank you for this incredible overview of where we are in the world. I wanted to talk to you about a little bit more about the China's rise and the Belt and Road Initiative, and how you view that country as it engaged with others. I'm sorry. Yes.
So about China's rise and its...
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. I got distracted. That's the issue with me. I get text messages and emails at the same time while I'm hosting this. Yes. So if you could talk a little bit more about the Belt and Road Initiative and their prolific investment in Africa and their engagement across the globe, and how that will impact us in the future. And you talked about they will have a 2% growth rate. Where is that coming from?
Well, I think it's I think that I haven't seen the sort of data on the composition of Chinese output, but the general answer to the question of why they got a 2% growth rate is, in the first quarter, particularly, spread over a bit to the second quarter, they acted very, very, very decisively to contain the pandemic and limit it overwhelmingly to Wuhan, which was clearly the epicenter of the original infection. And they did that by closing down Wuhan and closing all its connections to the rest of China. And they were successful in eliminating it, obviously very ruthlessly, in Wuhan. And because they acted so quickly, and so effectively to control what was initially a very, very minor spread, they prevented any significant outbreaks in the rest of the country. And when very small outbreaks emerged, they were able to suppress them. Right. So China became COVID-free, as far as I can see. I haven't been there over this period. They don't allow anyone in. They've controlled income inflows of people very, very tightly. So China became essentially COVID-free. And And of course, once that happened, the domestic economy could recover very quickly. And as in addition, that's a huge part of demand, of course, in China is domestic demand. And it's much less export dependent than it was 15 years ago before the financial crisis. One of the consequences of it, in fact, was that that became the case, more dependent on domestic investment and consumption. But in addition, once the rest of the world economy began to recover in the third quarter and at least didn't collapse in the fourth quarter, China's exports have done very well across a whole range of products in which China is the most competitive supplier, including, of course, health-related products. So that, as far as I can see, is why China has managed to grow a bit. Other East Asian economies have also done pretty well economically. South Korea is not going to grow, but it's going to shrink very, very little. And it's a more open and trade-dependent economy. So that it's not unique, this performance, to China, but China is extreme. Then you asked about China in the world. This is a longer-term proposition. Obviously, though, its reputation will have been enhanced by the effectiveness of its response to the crisis, which has been clearly remarkable from an organizational point of view. I think there are so many elements of this, but there are two elements of this. First of all, China is the natural dominant trading partner for Asian economies, East Asian, Pacific, even to some degree South Asian economies, less so decisively. So its continuing rise, relative growth, which has obviously continued through the crisis, makes it an ever more attractive trading partner for countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, all of ASEAN. And this is, of course, now going to be reinforced by the agreement on RCEP, the Regional Cooperation Program, which will essentially give them free trade in the whole East Asia and Pacific region. With China, obviously the biggest market. Secondly, China has indeed invested very, very heavily in economies in the Belt and Road Initiative, in Central Asia, throughout Asia and into Africa. There are the money involved, as far as I can see, relative to the Chinese economy is not colossal, but relative to the recipients, it's very, very significant. The investments naturally tie countries into the Chinese economic system. It has also created quite a lot of bad debt. And one of the big questions in the COVID-19 crisis is how well China will cooperate with the other creditors in managing what's going to be a lot of bad debt associated with their investments, almost inevitable. My understanding, and I haven't followed this so closely, is that China is now cooperating with the so-called Paris Club, which is the group of official creditors of emerging and developing countries. So that's quite an important step towards multilateralism. But as China becomes an increasingly important creditor, like other creditors historically, it will find itself wrapped up in debt negotiations of all kinds. In the long run, I think this program is an important part of China's outreach, becoming an increasingly central economic power for the world. And it's even affecting Europe because particularly quite a number of the smaller countries in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe have become very close to China economically. And that makes it certainly more difficult for the Europeans to agree a position vis-a-vis China. But I should stress, though it's not part of the Belt and Road Initiative in any real way, that even for Germany, China is now as important a trading partner as the United States. So it's a very real consideration for the Germans, what sort of position they wish to take vis-a-vis China. Though it should also be stressed that the Germans are very concerned about their position of technological leadership vis-a-vis China. So the relationships with the Western countries and the North America, of course, are very complex and difficult. But overall, China's done very well in this crisis, as it did very well in the financial crisis, and it is becoming inevitably, because of this and because of its continued growth, an enormously important trading partner
So I
for
need you to ask the
many
next
countries.
question.
Okay, that finishes that.
That's great. So I think we have a question from Dory. Oh, we have questions in the queue.
We do have questions in the. Okay. Go
Okay,
ahead,
so
Deirdre.
Dory, I'll let you
Okay.
manage that, Dory. Thank you.
Okay. Well, one of the questions you answered in regard to the 2% growth in China, but they continue on and ask, what about China's relationship with countries that the U.S. Typically do not have relationships with, such as Cuba or Russia, and how would this affect their growth, their continued growth, and the U.S. lack of growth?
Well, I don't know anything about China's economic relations with Cuba. Perhaps I should, but I don't. Obviously, Cuba is a very small economy, so it's not going to have much effect on China. It's a politically symbolic country, of course, I know this very well. I'm assuming that the Biden administration will actually try to continue where the Obama administration left off and develop further relations with Cuba. But I don't think from an economic as opposed to a political issue, that really is very important to either partner. It should be noted, by the way, that, and I don't know how they're going to handle it, China is a very large creditor of Venezuela, which is comprehensively bust. And so there's going to be a lot of debt, which they're going to have to write off there, where that, of course, has become a total tragedy. The relations with Russia are more interesting. I think what's happened is that Russia is basically, which is obviously apart from the military side and the resource side, a very economically weak country compared with China now, and of course, vastly smaller economy. I mean, Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's. So the significant is it's a military power and as a producer of raw materials, particularly oil and energy products. So there's no economic dependence. And of course, China here vis-a-vis Russia plays two roles. Since Russia's relations with the West are so bad and are likely to remain so, it has been driven, or I would argue driven itself, into a close relationship with China. But it's a relationship in which Russia, of course, is inevitably, except on the military side, a secondary power. It is a subordinate power to China. So a complete reversal of the situation half a century ago, or 60 years ago, or 70 years ago or so under Stalin. And that's a difficult situation for Russia. I have a suspicion in the long run, Russia won't want to remain in that position, but they may have little choice. There's a secondary factor, which is, of course, that through its relationship with energy producers, particularly in Central Asia, but also now increasingly, I think, in the Middle East, China will want to make itself and is making itself as independent as it can of Russian oil and gas, which again undermines Russia's position vis-a-vis China. So I see what's coming out as an alliance of convenience, an alliance of unequals, an alliance in which China is increasingly dominant. And over time, I suspect it's an alliance in which the dominance of China will increase unless and until Russia decides, which doesn't seem likely under Putin, that a more equal relationship with the West and with China will be to its benefit. But that's basically how I see this relationship.
Okay, so a follow-up question someone asked in regards to Russia is, do you know how COVID has affected Russia economically?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly were one of the economies that were pushed into recession. It doesn't seem to have been a dramatic one on the figures that I've seen. They've, as Deirdre mentioned, they have applied a vaccine of their own relatively quickly, assuming it's effective. One would assume that business will go back reasonably to normal in Russia next year. The big question for Russia, however, in my view, is structural, not COVID-19, which is underneath it. The economy is fairly slow growing, has been fairly slow growing really since the financial crisis. It remains very commodity dependent. So the very low oil prices we've seen have been very damaging for Russia. My guess is if the energy transition means anything, that can only get worse, that oil prices will continue to be very low and therefore very unfavorable, overall low. They will wobble a lot around. There will be periods of higher prices and periods of lower prices, but overall, the boom days are probably over for the oil and gas sector in Russia. And therefore, and the demography of Russia is also unfavorable. So my expectation is that overall, as I have indicated, we're going to see continuing relative decline for Russia vis-a-vis China, and probably certainly vis-a-vis the US, and possibly even vis-a-vis Western Europe, though that's much less certain, given that Western Europe has some of the same demographic and economic problems.
Thank you. So your comment on the oil industry, is that specific to Russia, or do you think that would be the same issue?
That's a quite general issue. I mean, I was in a webinar, very interesting webinar with a very significant oil and gas consulting firm yesterday, with a lot of oil and gas industry specialists. If you believe the energy transition is going to be serious, and that's a very big question, and therefore renewables are going to take an increasing part of energy supply worldwide as technology advances and the costs of renewables fall, while there will continue to be demand for oil and gas, there's no doubt about it, it is plausible that the oil and gas industry and coal industry for that matter will at the best stagnate and worst will tend to decline. Therefore, there will still have to be investment in possibly in replacing existing supply, but prices will remain low because of the demand pressure from the supply pressure from other sources. So this would be a relatively unbuoyant, a relatively poor environment. The only way in which I think that won't occur, but it probably be spotty, is if periods of low prices lead to some shifting again towards oil and gas, away from renewables, if governments allow that to happen. And then periods of rapid economic growth might lead to temporary spikes in oil and gas prices. But overall, I'm expecting that over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and that's what I think most people in the oil and gas industry expect, is this will be an industry in decline.
Okay, great. So we have a couple questions regarding the future. One being, how much has COVID or 2020 at large changed the way we predict how much growth the country is expected to experience?
I think that at the moment, people still think it's a temporary shock more than a long-term determinant of future progress. The shock is big. So there will be scarring, as I've said. Investment will probably, the capital stock, as it were, will be permanently smaller than it would otherwise have been. Human skills will have certainly been negatively affected, possibly for the very long term, if the impact on children at school is not fully reversed in the next few years, and there's clearly been negative impact. So one would expect the economy to be sort of consistently smaller than it would otherwise have been. That's what most forecasts suggest, though nobody knows. But the underlying sources of growth, innovation, technological progress, and investment ought to return. And indeed, in the case of technological progress, if anything, they've been accelerated. We have in terms of the way we organize our offices, in the way we organize work, in the way we work together, the way we shop. We've sort of leapt maybe 5 years in one. That will allow quite radical changes in the way that the economy operates. Some of them could be quite disruptive. You know, if businesses can employ people working from home next door, they can also do so by employing people working from home in other countries. So this could be quite disruptive, accelerating the development of a sort of global virtual labor market. But these are sources of growth as well as disruption. They usually go together. And in all, my guess is that if anything, from a technological point of view and an adoption of technology point of view, COVID-19 has been a major accelerator. The other aspect of it, which I think is very interesting, is whether it will lead to a permanent change in the way supply chains operate globally. One of the things COVID-19 has clearly done, and I've already emphasized this with my discussion of systemic risk, is reminded us of the fragility of supply chains which are not adequately diversified and then turn out to be not sufficiently robust in a crisis, or not sufficiently resilient, not capable of being reconfigured. And one of the questions that businesses all over the world have to ask for themselves is, how much can we afford to spend on creating supply chains or other systems, stockpiles and so forth, which allow us to ride through shocks of this kind with relatively little problem. I think we have to say overall, the supply chain problems that emerged in the early part of the crisis were overcome with extraordinary speed. But I suspect that many businesses will conclude from this, and the sort of disruption in relations with China will reinforce this, that they need to diversify their supply chains, which doesn't necessarily mean taking them back home, but might be taking them closer to home, or at least diversifying suppliers if they continue to use East Asian suppliers, which is very good for Vietnam, for example. So that change also, I suspect, has been accelerated by COVID-19.
Thank you. The next question up is, in recent years, nationalism has taken a greater hold in several countries. How has this affected global markets?
That's a very, very good question. I think nationalism has taken a greater hold in just about every country. China is more nationalistic overtly than it was 15 years ago. Russia under Putin, Mr. Putin is certainly more nationalistic than it was under Yeltsin or Gorbachev. In the US, certainly Mr. Trump was a more overtly nationalistic leader than any other, really, since the Second World War. With Mr. Biden, there's a reversal, but I don't expect it to go away. And you see the same in Britain and in India and in Turkey and in Brazil. I mean, this is across different classes of country. It's become very common. And I think it has deep-seated roots. It's a backlash against liberalization, economic liberalization and globalization, driven in part by the losers or the people who feel they're likely to become losers from this process, and driven also by a reaction against globalist ideologies, the idea that people are citizens of the world, as it were. Openness to migration is one reflection of that. And the people who fear they are losers of that are the people for whom their national identity is a central source, or if not the central source, of their social and economic security. So I think this is a profound re-establishment or reinforcement of those ideas in reaction to what's happened in the previous 40 years. And I expect that to continue. What does it mean for the economy? It means that governments will tend to be more protectionist, which they pretty clearly are. They will be more concentrated on creating technological self-sufficiency. And you can see this notably in the technology area with the attempt essentially to cripple Huawei and other leading Chinese companies by the US. There's a closer linkage between the security sector, the defense establishment broadly defined, and economic policy. These used to be run in the globalization era more or less completely independently. Increasingly, people are looking at military security and technological and economic security side by side, and I expect that to continue as well. It's already there and will continue. Regulation has already become very significant as part of that. The most obvious example is the Chinese decision to exclude the Western tech companies from their economy pretty well. The big ones, the Googles, the Facebooks, Amazons. And I expect other countries to follow the same example. The Western countries will exclude effectively the major Chinese tech companies. In fact, we're already seeing that happen. I expect that to be reinforced. So, and with that will go a segmentation of regulation of these sectors. And I think that's likely to occur also to significant measure with the financial sector. So it's not clear whether this will end up with national systems or systems which are more in silos created by alliances like the Western Alliance, or if that doesn't work very well, by the US and the EU separately, with China somewhere else. And that will create lots of big questions for, which I've already discussed in different contexts, for emerging and developing countries, which will be, do we try to be a part of all systems? Are we forced to choose to be part of the Chinese system or part of the Western system? And if so, how do we make those choices? That is likely to be part of the environment. But I don't think, it's not what I want, but I don't think we're going to see in this sort of environment a restoration of the sort of global multilateral order, which we believed we were creating in the early 2000s with the arrival of with China's accession to the World Trade Organization. I think the Biden administration will be more inclined towards pursuing multilateral solutions or solutions through multilateral organs like the WTO, but I don't think we'll see a full restoration of the pre-financial crisis world. And nationalism and security orientation, the security orientation of many nationalist impulses will reinforce that.
All right, great. We're going to ask one more question so that we could close it up. And this question is in regard to Biden. So interested to hear your thoughts about Biden's challenge over the next 4 years to restabilize the U.S. position, not only to Americans, but also to the world.
Well, I wish Mr. Biden well and every success. I want him to succeed very much, as I wanted Mr. Obama to succeed. But I have come to the view, I'm afraid, that the divisions within the US, of which, of course, you will be more aware than I am, are too deep to be resolved by any presidency that we're likely to have. And this election has underlined how deep those divisions are, ideologically, on multiple dimensions, socially, ethnically, culturally. And I don't believe that Mr. Biden can resolve that. I just don't see how he can go about it. On the contrary, I expect, given their position in Congress, that Republicans will again do everything they possibly can to make him fail. And I don't think it will be terribly difficult for them to succeed in that aim and to blame him for those failures, because he will want to make government work. And it's far easier to make government fail than to make it work, if you're really determined to stop it. So I think he's going to have a very, very difficult time. He will rely obviously very much on executive orders, and he will be able to do a fair amount in that via that. And he can do quite a bit in foreign policy, but anything that involves spending money is going to be a really, really big problem for him. And in some areas, he's going to have to spend money. And he's going to be particularly difficult given the debt position and fiscal position he has inherited. The one bit of good luck, if I say, he has, which is very important, is that there's a reasonable chance, even if, just by being moderately competent, that there will be a good recovery in the next year or two from the COVID-19 disaster. The economy shrank significantly, not as bad as some of the others, but it shrank significantly. The vaccines are rolled out. That should give them good recovery. That should increase people's optimism. So it's a very different situation from Obama when he got into power. There should be a recovery, not a deep recession. Maybe that will help him to gain credibility with the American public. He is himself, I think, a relatively emollient centrist, and maybe this will allow him to gain real credibility and to do very well in the midterms in both House and Senate, despite the many problems with that. And that could then begin to lead a sort of real revival of effective government in America. But it's going to be, it seems to me, a very, very, very tough road that he has ahead of him, with real chances that Trumpism, well, not perhaps with Trump or without it, will continue to dominate the Republican Party because it's their electoral platform and has been now for decades, and increasingly so, and that it will continue to be politically effective. So I'm very concerned about the future effectiveness of the American state and of American policymaking and of America's role in the world.
Martin, thank you. We're at time now. Thank you for this incredible overview. We're all hopeful for President-elect Biden and that he can re-engage us back on the world platform where we belong. And we're also hopeful for the 5th of January and that we can secure the Senate and that he will be able to push more of his policies through without obstruction. And I know that's a wish upon the star. But I thank you very much. And I thank all of the participants on the call. It's good to see you, Martin. I wish you and Allison an early happy Hanukkah. And yeah, and I will be in touch with you on the back end. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, and I share the same wishes for Mr. Biden's success. Very, very much.
Yes. It's back to normalcy.
Bye.
Bye.